Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Find the chat function and say hello to me. Well, and to Andrew as well. Oh, we've got royalty. We have the chair of IRMS here. Hi, Reynold. Got loads of people still tuning in, so just give it a few minutes. There's a poll live already for you, if you want to go and have a look at the polls as well. Sorry, Andrew, you was going to say?
Just to point out that I've got a cat that's become quite active at 3:30 in the morning.
How very strange, yes. So yes.
So if you see me, if I'm looking in other directions, that's why. It's because the cat's being a nuisance.
Yeah. So we are playing Spot the Cat tonight. We've got people requesting that they want to see the cat, and I'm sure that she will make an appearance. Not too far away. It's Spider. That's what I'm doing.
Is the cat?
Oh, there's a cat. The dog's out on the walk. But there's the cat. You can have the cat for now. RM dog is out and about having a trot around the park.
Here she goes again.
And Reynold, the chair of RMS, has a very active, I think, pug. I think the dog's a pug. And joins in on whenever he's on camera. So you're not the only one, Andrew, with active. People are saying that all webinars should have cats and or dogs. Apparently the pug's called Gizmo. And it's very, very affectionate.
If anyone's curious, the cat's name is Cat.
For real?
For real. She's indifferent to any name that you give her. So she's Cat.
Oh, okay. Has everybody got sound? Can you all hear me and can you all hear Andrew? Yeah, excellent. Fab. Well, we've got 132 currently logged in. We did have 234 registered, so we've already got a 50% arrival, which is great. What countries have we got logged in? UK, Canada, Norway, Scotland. Wow. Wales, Northern Ireland. This is fascinating. Okay. What? Is that the cat?
Can you hear a noise here?
Yeah.
She's ripping apart something.
Oh, we've got Ireland as well. They'll say fair play to the cat. I'd start ripping stuff open as well.
She has a tendency to come up next to me and just put her claws in my leg to get attention.
Oh.
So if you see me grimace, you'll know it's probably a cat that's doing that. She'll make an appearance soon after.
Fair enough. Right. Okay. So I think we've got what the people that we're going to have on now. It's great to see all 134 of you. Thank you very much. And I hope you haven't missed me too much with not having a webinar last week. And so this is the first one in 2 weeks. And basically, I have the pleasure of having Andrew Warland. He's actually based in Australia and it's currently somewhere around 3:30 in the morning, which my socks are blown off completely. Because when I was talking to him about coming on a webinar, I had no idea that he'd get up for 3:30 for, well, I was going to say for me, but for everyone else here today. So thank you, a massive thank you to Andrew on that one. I've come across Andrew quite a lot in several years. I think I've probably known you since the beginning of my career, really, 2007. Yes, he's one of the top 5 people that I always think about when it comes to Office 365. And he, being in Australia, we've never got to meet face to face yet. So hopefully one day that will change. So we're going to have questions throughout. Please, by all means, put them in the questions tab, not in the chat, because there are 136 of you now. If you put them in the chat, I may miss them. So when you find the questions tab, it's between chat and polls. Put a question in there, and I will interrupt Andrew at hopefully a convenient point, and we'll get some questions answered for you throughout. We are likely to run up to the 8 o'clock deadline on this one, just because it's a massive subject. So I appreciate, obviously, if anyone has to drop off because they have other requirements, then that's fine. I won't be offended. Okay, basically, let's hand it over to Andrew. And yeah, go for it, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Emily. What's the numbers now, just before I start?
136.
All right. Maybe you can do with fingers or something, 1, 3, 4, 5, whatever. No, I'm just joking. Good evening. Hello, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this session at whatever time you are in at this moment. Thank you very much to Emily for organising this and for asking me to participate. Really appreciate it. It's very kind of you to do that. As Emily said, I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I was previously based in Sydney, so some of you may have known me from, or mentioning the fact that I was in Sydney. Now I'm in Melbourne, and it's freezing cold here. We don't have dromedaries, possums, or kangaroos very much around this area, but I thought I'd just show a little slide there for the fun of it. By way of brief background, until mid last year, for 7 years, I was the senior data and information architect for Uniting Care, which is a Uniting Church-based organisation in New South Wales, in Sydney, based out of Sydney, with 9,000 staff. When I joined there in 2012, I asked them, do you have a records, who's the records manager? And they said, we don't have one. Do you have a record keeping system? We don't have one. I said, for 9,000 staff, how do you manage records? And they said, we just do. It was rather extraordinary to join such a large organization with no understanding of records management. So I came in and was the owner of, brought in SharePoint basically as a way to manage records, SharePoint 2010. We then migrated a couple of years later to SharePoint 2013, and we implemented Office 365 as it was then known back in 2016, and that included SharePoint Online. And from about 2017 onwards, for a year or so, we began to migrate all of our on-premise SharePoint to SharePoint Online, following the model that Microsoft suggests. And that was all done by mid-2019, and that's when I ceased working for Uniting. But in that role, I was also the information architect, so I was responsible for data modeling, and a whole bunch of other things. But by the time I left, I was one of the global administrators for Microsoft 365, one of the SharePoint administrators, and I had all the data stuff as well. Before I was at Uniting, I was at the City of Sydney, where I implemented their digital record keeping strategy using their TRIM product, now known as Content Manager, across the City of Sydney. That was a very interesting experience for me, because it brought me in touch with managing records in a system that I wasn't particularly fond of, but it also taught me a lot about how to manage records using that system, and then how to apply that in the SharePoint environment. Prior to that, for about 10 years, I worked for a private Sydney-based company running their consulting, their information management consulting, where we used a range of products. So including Objective, Documentum, Alfresco, you name it, we used it. And that was just, or at least we helped people with it. And for 20 years prior to that, I worked for the Australian government. So in a completely different role, unconnected to what I'm doing these days. So very interesting, different experience in some ways. I just wanted to point out that I'm not affiliated with any vendor. So I'm not here to sell you a product. I'm not here to push a particular product. I'm here to talk only about Microsoft 365. It would be nice to be funded somehow by Microsoft for doing this, but I'm not. I work as a freelance independent consultant based in Melbourne, helping organizations really to understand who've got Microsoft 365, what they can do with it, and if they want to manage records in it, what they need to do to manage records in it. So the information I'm passing on today is based on real life experience doing this in Uniting with a very large organization, but it's also based on how other people are using it, including in conjunction with a EDRMS product, or sometimes other products as well too. So now,
I have to say, there's something really quite special about you, that not only have you got up at 3:30 in the morning, you're not being paid to do this either. So
no, I get no recompensation. Get no compensation for doing this. So the key takeaways in this fairly short session, I must say, you need a plan. And to be honest, the people who approach Microsoft 365 without a plan are just kind of, you're going to have problems, I think. You really need to understand how this environment works, and you need to have some form of a plan, even if it's written down. I've got, actually, for anyone who can see it, I've got a plan on a piece of paper here, which is what I went through with one organization yesterday, how to plan for Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365, as we'll see in a minute, there's multiple interrelated elements. One of the things that I've noticed, there needs to be really good cooperation, collaboration between IT and records managers. I've often seen, I do this work with IT people, and I do this work with records and information managers, and sometimes they don't talk to each other, and sometimes their relationship isn't the greatest. IT don't particularly want to give something away to the records management people. The records managers don't really understand how the system works. So you get this bit of a tension between the two. And I know that some take advantage of that tension between the two. You'll see that Microsoft 365 is more about in-place storage with centralized controls and functionality, as opposed to centralized storage in, say, an EDRMS, where everything is meant to be put into that central location and managed in that location. You can still have an EDRMS if you're using Microsoft 365. SharePoint Online is only as complicated as you want to make it. The previous versions of SharePoint were relatively complicated. SharePoint Online is relatively simple by comparison. And sometimes a mistake is that people make SharePoint, try to make SharePoint Online like SharePoint on-premise and complicate it and customize it and do lots of things that they probably shouldn't. SharePoint Online, SPO, has a lot of functionality that you can use for records management. And the last point here, the second last point, is that something called Project Cortex, if you've not heard about it, is quite interesting, and I think has the potential to be a record-keeping game changer, but not for a few years, because of the way it works. So we'll come to that towards the end of the presentation. And as I said at the beginning, you need a plan. Because I work with a lot of government clients here in Australia, both in Victoria and other parts of Australia, I often get the question, what does our record-keeping institution or archival institution think about Microsoft 365? Are we allowed to use it? So this is the view from the Public Records Office of Victoria. And they did a survey this year, and that survey came up with some interesting information. A lot of people are using Microsoft 365. There's minimal configuration, particularly for records management. EDRMS is still used. You can read that for yourself. But importantly, there are gaps in knowledge. And part of the role that I see that I'm playing, particularly with webinars like this and other sessions, similar sessions, is to help records managers understand, and also IT understand, what you can do with Microsoft 365, and importantly, what you can't do. There are weaknesses, there are points that you need to understand, and this may influence your decision making about what you do with Microsoft 365. The Prov here recommended that you learn more about it and you do a gap analysis. That is to say, understand what Microsoft 365 can do, understand what you're trying to do, and work out what you need to do, and set the controls in Microsoft 365. And particularly, and they emphasize this quite a bit, is to minimize the risks associated with your records. Now, what this kind of translates to in practical terms is that for those records that need to be transferred to archives or kept for a very long time, spend a lot of time focusing on those ones and how to manage those records. You might, for example, decide to keep those sort of records in an EDRMS because that might provide better protection for them for the longer term. Whereas your everyday working documents that only need to be kept for, say, between 3 and 7 years, they perhaps require less effort to manage and less record keeping responsibility in terms of all the things you might consider doing. And there's another set of records, and that's the low-level working records, the so-called ROT, the redundant, outdated, and trivial records that people often find in organizations that aren't really records. They're just stuff that's there that often fill up network drives and so on. All right. So I hope I didn't jump a slide there. No. So this is an overview, and this slide, I'm going to come back to this regularly throughout this presentation. So sorry if you'll see this quite a few times. I think about 4 or 5 times that you'll see this again and again. But I'm going to be talking to large parts of this diagram. In a sense, this diagram provides the overview of everything that impacts on the management of records in Microsoft 365. And I'm going to talk to the specific points. The important thing to understand is that in the past, people often thought of SharePoint as being, that's the only place where you manage records. So the focus was on SharePoint as the record keeping system, particularly when it was on premise. SharePoint had no other connection usually, or maybe it integrated, but often didn't. Emily?
Someone is saying, how do you propose handling physical records management in Office 365?
Yes, good question. The quick answer to that is, in Uniting, we managed all of our physical records in SharePoint using SharePoint lists. There was really no other system that we needed. We managed about 35,000 boxes of records in storage using entirely SharePoint. The benefit of doing it that way was we were able to you could do a global search across everything you had access to in SharePoint. So because we documented what was in the boxes, that went off to storage, you could do a search in SharePoint to say, I'm looking for Grace Jones' record, and it would tell you it's in this box, in this storage location, so that you could then contact the storage provider and have it returned for you. We had a relatively low retrieval rate from our offsite storage, so that made it perhaps more easy to use SharePoint to do this, but it was our central system to do it. We had a dedicated site for physical records. So all right, so the point here is that this is, particularly on the right-hand side, is where the records are stored. There's a green box around those red boxes. The green box is what's called the Azure substrate, and essentially everything in Microsoft 365 is stored in that Azure substrate. The benefit of that is that everything in the Microsoft 365 backend can be subject to what's called the graph. We'll come to that in a minute. And also search. So you can do a global search of everything that's stored in Microsoft 365. So you're not just searching in SharePoint, you can search private Teams chat, you can search in Outlook messages, you can search in OneDrive. But of course, a global search like that comes with very strong responsibility to make sure that you're not abusing that. And there are a lot of controls around the global search capability in terms of who can access it and so on. We'll come to that as we go through. So I'm going to be, as I said, repeating this slide, but just doing this and showing that this is what I'm about to talk about. So I'm going to be now talking about the admin side. Now, we're only going to talk about this briefly because, as I said, all of this is interconnected. And we're going to be talking about user licenses, roles, groups, and external sharing. Each of these 4 elements impacts on the management of records in the way that I'll describe. So for users and licenses, if you're going to be managing records, you probably, in Microsoft 365 or having any kind of responsibility for managing records, you almost certainly will need to have a compliance, the compliance admin role to be able to access things like global searches or to set up retention policies, which we'll get to in a minute. The recommendation now, this might be important, but generally everybody, when you access Microsoft 365, you will have a license to access it. But if you're going to be an administrator of any sort, you would normally have a cloud-only account in Microsoft 365, because you can't access anything on premise with that. And that cloud-only account is what controls what you can access. So if you're an admin, you will see an admin icon when you log on to Office 365, and that admin icon, depending on what your role is, will then give you access to certain elements. So the certain elements are defined in the roles. So you'll be a user, you'll be assigned a license, and if you've got a particular admin role, you're likely, if you're doing any kind of records management stuff, to be a global admin. Probably unlikely, but you never know. You might have the ability to be a global admin, the compliance admin role, or one of the admins for Exchange, for SharePoint, for OneDrive, and for Microsoft Teams. It's quite common it's not quite common, but it's not unusual for records managers to also have a SharePoint admin role. So the point here is that if you given access to Microsoft 365, you will probably you may have one of those roles. You may be the SharePoint admin, for example, or you probably should get to know who they are. Now, the next point is groups, and this is really important. And I'm going to come back to that little diagram on the right-hand side in a separate slide in a few minutes. But I just want to point out this is something that is new to Microsoft 365, newish to Microsoft 365, that it is probably one of the most poorly understood elements of Microsoft 365 by most people. Most organizations are quite familiar with distribution lists and security groups. Commonly, they're known as AD groups. You hear people talk about AD groups, but what they mean when they say that is either a distribution list that you use when you're sending an email to multiple people, a DL is often referred to, or a security group. Security groups are what provides access to IT resources. So when you join an organization, you are assigned to at least one security group, probably multiple security groups. And those security groups are what give you access to the different resources across the system. Microsoft introduced the concept of a Microsoft 365 group a couple of years ago. Those Microsoft 365 groups are kind of, in some ways, like a combination between a distribution list, in the sense that you can use it for emails. They're also a shared mailbox in that sense, and a security group in that they control access to resources in Microsoft 365. And this is a really important point, because every Microsoft 365 group has its own mailbox and it has its own SharePoint site. The diagram to the right of that, which we'll talk about more in a minute, is showing that if you allow people to create Microsoft Teams, if you allow end users to create Microsoft Teams, it creates a Microsoft 365 group, which also creates a mailbox and a SharePoint site. Now, if you're managing SharePoint and you're looking at records management and managing records in SharePoint, and your end users can create teams, be aware that every team has its own SharePoint site. And if you allow private channels in Microsoft Teams, it also creates that SharePoint site, another SharePoint site. So Microsoft 365 groups are really important to understand, in the sense of they create the mailbox and they create the SharePoint site. As I said, we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So I'll just go over that for the moment. I'll pass by it for the moment. The next and last point on this slide is external sharing. It's important to understand that the external sharing option at the admin level is more or less an on-off switch. It doesn't immediately provide external sharing. What it does is say you have one of 4 options for external sharing if you care to turn it on in SharePoint. So it just, by default, SharePoint sites don't have any external sharing enabled. If you enable external sharing at the admin level, then SharePoint sites individually can have external sharing enabled. The external sharing has 4 options. One is anonymous. You probably would never ever use it, and I'm not sure why they even put it there, but there is an option for anonymous. One is existing users, which is a bit limited. Another one is new and existing users, and the last one is only people within the organization. We found that it was fine to use new and existing users, but again, we'll come to that point when we look at SharePoint. But just to let you know, at this point, at the admin level, at the top of the whole organization of Microsoft 365, external sharing is where, sorry, the option to set external sharing is there. So if you're wondering about external sharing, you probably need to talk to IT to enable it if it's not already enabled. But you need to understand what it's going to do. The next point here, we're going to be talking about compliance. So if you're a compliance administrator or a global administrator and you log on to Microsoft, the office.com Microsoft 365 environment, you'll see the admin option, the application to click on, which we've just looked at briefly. You should also see the compliance option. So this is from the red circle on the left is from office.com. So I can see I've got access to the compliance center. So we're going to talk about that. So access to the compliance center requires you to have a compliance admin role or a global admin role. The left-hand side shows options, most of the options available from the compliance admin center. At the top left, Emily?
Does external sharing mean sharing from one group to another, but all in an organization rather than sharing outside the organization?
It's more about outside the organization. External sharing by its nature is about sharing externally. Internal sharing is normally on by default. So it's the default option if you're not going to share externally. So you can, you have to choose one of 4 options, and the default option, actually the default option starts as anonymous. You should change that and make it internal users only. And that's set at the global admin level.
And I've got another question. Sorry, we've moved on from the point, but I hope you don't mind answering.
Right.
For the physical records, did you manage the retention and disposal as well through lists, or was that managed by your offsite storage vendor?
A combination of both. Our offsite storage provider provided us with lists of records due for disposal from time to time. That gave us a heads up. We then used that list of records and we cross-checked it with our own internal lists, our SharePoint lists. We would then look at, well, can these records be disposed of? We exported the list of records that could be disposed of, sent them to the manager and said to the manager, can we destroy these records? If they approved it, we then went back to the offsite storage provider who gave us a destruction approval request, which was signed by the manager. It went back, they destroyed the records, we got the destruction certificate, and all of that information going backwards and forwards was recorded in that same site. So we had a record of the destruction, but no records were destroyed unless they were approved, and we also knew what was in those boxes. Occasionally we'd find boxes that we didn't know what was in them, and they were subject to a number of different ways of finding out what was in them, including me going out to the storage warehouse and having a look, and occasionally asking someone else to go and have a look. Does that answer the question, Emily?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So back to the Compliance Center. So I just want to again emphasize that to access the Compliance Center of Microsoft 365, you do require being a global administrator or being a compliance administrator. So that's a specific role. Once you've got access to those roles, you can get into this section where you can access the audit logs. We'll come to these later. You can do a global search. That means searching across everything in Microsoft 365, including private chats, so personal chats and personal emails. But it's a hugely powerful role, so you'd want to be careful who you give this to. And there's some other things that happen when you do those searches. But the more important ones that I want to focus on here are information governance and the so-called records management option, which has been the subject of a bit of discussion on various emails and in various forums around the place. I've got to say I'm a bit annoyed with Microsoft, in a sense, hijacking the term records management, because it looks like it's a records management solution, as they call it, and it's not. It sounds like all you've got to do is buy this, pay a lot of money for these licenses and have a records management solution, when in fact it just really extends the options that are already available in information governance, and it's probably mostly suitable for American corporations that have a lot of money that need to meet certain compliance requirements. So for the day-to-day, what we call records management, what we know as records management, you probably won't find this so-called solution is going to meet your requirements. So I'll just explain that a bit further, but let me explain first. So we've got two sections, information governance and records management. In the information governance section, when you click on it, the 5 tabs that display are labels. You can read them for yourself: label, policies, etc. Labels are basically like tags. So you create a label that defines how long you keep records, and we'll see a couple of screenshots of these in a sec. So basically the concept is you create a label, you then publish that label, or more than one label, as a label policy. When you publish it, you then decide where those policies or where those labels are going to take effect. So which part of Microsoft 365 do you want to apply these labels to? And you also have the ability to create retention policies. So Microsoft clearly haven't thought this one through very well because it's quite confusing. So a label is published as a label policy, but you can also create a retention policy that is not a label policy. Now, labels and label policies, in my view, are most likely to be used in SharePoint and on SharePoint document libraries. They're less likely to be used in things like email or OneDrive, because that assumes that end users will consistently apply those labels to those messages, to that content, and they generally don't do that. So, as I said, it tends to be that labels will be published to SharePoint. And I've got a diagram in a sec that will show you an example model of how this might work. My view is that if you have retention policies, records retention schedules or retention authorities of some sort, disposal authorities, every class in that disposal authority probably should be created as a label. So there should be a label for every class. So financial records, 7 years, that becomes a label. That label can then be published as a label policy and applied to a site, a SharePoint site, where there are financial records being stored. There are some implications of applying a label policy, one of which is that it stops people deleting records, which is what it's meant to do. Yes, Emily?
We have a question that I'm not sure if it fits into the current question, but I'm worried that I'll lose it if I don't ask it. Is it better to create groups in Microsoft 365 and let that drive site creation, or create teams and let that drive things through the collaboration experience? And
can I answer that question when I get to that slide?
Yeah, sure.
The quick answer is it's better to create the groups first.
The other part is there actually any point in having having SharePoint sites anymore?
Yes, there is.
Okay, fab. I'm sure you'll tell us more in a bit. So
yeah, the context of that question we might need to come back to, but yes is a quick answer. There's no reason not to have SharePoint sites, as we'll see in a minute. The other two bits on the information governance are import and archive. Import allows you to import content. It's fairly limited, and I don't even know why it's here, because it's really nothing to do with information governance. And the archive is about email mailboxes, archiving email mailboxes. Again, I don't know why it's here. I suspect that Microsoft are moving these things around a little bit and going, well, this goes with this goes with this, etc. Now, the records management options at the bottom, and actually I can't see this because of this thing at the bottom. There we go. So records management provides an overview, which gives you a dashboard of what's happening with labels and label policies. It has what's called a file plan, which allows you to import your records authority, your records disposition or disposal authorities against some sort of a taxonomy, like a business classification scheme. That sounds great, but what it does is effectively allows you to map your disposal authority classes to a taxonomy, so a function activity based model. Sounds great in practice, in theory, but in practice it doesn't quite work that way. And I think it's got limited use, but some organizations might find it useful to have that. The file plan option used to be available for E3, for information governance. They've moved it up to E5, which is kind of silly because it makes it even less useful when it's there, unless you've got the money to pay for it. You'll see that the next option with records management is label policies. Label policies are basically the extended version of the information governance label policies. So if you've only got an E3 license, you'll see labels and labels policies. If you've got an E5 license, you'll see label policies under records management with extended capability. We'll look at those in a minute. The other two options for records management are events, which allow you to create events. I find their events a bit strange because it suggests that you can just automatically delete content, destroy content based on certain events, such as an employee leaves, so let's destroy their records after a given point of time. I think there's better ways to do that from a records management point of view. This automated disposition or disposal is not, to me, a very practical or good way to do things. And disposition is the disposition review area. So on every label, you can assign, you can say at the end of the retention period, I want the content here to be subject to review. They call this disposition review. There's there's a number of issues with this, a lot of weaknesses with that disposition review process, not the least being that you get individual records, like every document, every email coming up for review. And it's not a really great way to do records disposal document by document. So you'd probably want to use it for selected purposes. We'll go to the next slide because some of this will become more obvious. Excuse me. So a retention label in the compliance area, so E3 and E5, I'll explain the difference between the two, but I'm primarily talking for most people. A retention label, so remember I said before that you create a retention label according to a class in your disposal authority. So think about, for example, financial management, 7 years, meetings, 5 years, whatever. So you create a label, you give it a name, you determine how long you want to keep this content for this long, 7 years, based on a trigger, which is date created modified, or the date the label was applied, or an event. Now these events, to be honest, I would avoid them because they just don't work terribly well. So I'm just going to focus on the created modified app applied. I would recommend, if you're going to create a label, that you base your label trigger on the date it's applied. Otherwise, what you get is a trickle of records coming through based on the date they were created or modified. If you use the date applied option and you apply that label to a SharePoint document library, then all of the records in that library will come due for disposition review or for the end of their disposal at the same time, rather than bit by bit by bit. Go ahead, Emily.
Just so you know, we do have a couple of people that are dropping off because there's really bad thunderstorms here in England specifically. But I just want to let everybody know that if they have to drop off because of safety side of things, that they can do. And they need to know that this is being recorded, so it will be shared on our YouTube page. So they need to like and subscribe the IRMS YouTube page so that they can get access to the video. We delete it off Livestorm because we don't keep the personal data. So I just wanted to kind of let people know about that so they'll be able to watch it in the future if they have to go for safety reasons. But I do have some other questions to you, Andrew.
Go ahead.
Microsoft Office 365 includes up to 36 different components, and I think you need to be flexible to establish the role of each component in your RM landscape, a flexible plan that may be changed if you find out some choices are not fit for your organization. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Yes, generally, as I said at the very beginning, you need a plan. My suggestion is to have a plan for managing records in Microsoft 365, and you document all the different options and you decide on what should be turned on, what should be enabled, etc. So having a plan is a great idea. The plans that I'm creating here are usually about 30 pages, 35 pages, and they just define, what are the principles, what are we trying to do, what are the settings, what do we agree on. Some of the issues might come up with IT. You need to have an agreement with IT about some of the points. But yes, I agree with that concept, if I understood it correctly.
Yes, so the next question is, I wonder if the import was useful to bring in data from other sources, such as obsolete system, to take advantage of the search and classification capabilities for a DSARS in particular. It's kind of just a Is that right?
Yeah, I would actually suggest this comes to, there's a slide towards the end where I talk about importing and migrating, but I wouldn't be using the import model there, what we just talked about. Instead, you need a bit of a plan. If you're going to import content, say from network file shares, you want really to maintain the integrity of the information, like the created dates and the authors and all that sort of stuff. So if you're going to bring in content, import content from, say, network file shares, then I would be suggesting you use a different product, like an independent product. For example, ShareGate. There's some other products on the market, but ShareGate, we used it. It's a great product. We use ShareGate to migrate content from drives to SharePoint, from SharePoint to SharePoint. The benefit of using a product like ShareGate is that it maintains the integrity of the records, and also importantly, it maintains the versions that you don't get if you're just using a simple migrate one-to-one model. So you need to be sure that you've got all of the content when you're migrating it, not just excuse me, not just the most recent version, and you certainly don't want the dates to be changed on that record.
So another question: how does the compliance add-in license work with the records management area? We're on E3, but have compliance add-in licenses tagged on.
I think if I understand that, it's probably what I'm describing now. So let me talk about that now, and if it isn't, we can come back to that, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
So the next point I was about to raise on the left-hand side is, under the triggers, is that the RM solution, the records management solution, so the E5 license, or I think the added compliance license, extends the options available when you create a label. So for example, you get the option to declare records when the label is applied. So if you want to use the ability to declare records in your environment, then E5, or I think the compliance add-on, will allow you to do that. There's something called a lock record, a preservation lock, which is a peculiarly American requirement that allows you to apply a preservation hold to certain records. It's a SEC requirement. And you've got extended auto apply options, which include the auto classification and machine learning capability that you get with the E5 license. So that's about building up your machine learning to understand what sort of records you've got, and looking across your Office 365 environment to find those records, and then auto apply a label, a retention label. Excuse me. There are some people who say that that's a really great solution. I'm still not buying it. I still feel that it needs to be understood better, and it probably only meets certain requirements. So I think the answer to that question you just asked, Emily, was those 3 dot points there, with probably a little bit more information. Excuse me.
There's people sharing your blog, Andrew, because they're going that there's quite some good feedback saying that they was new to Office 365 in February and having been using your blog to learn about RM functionality since then. He talks about it, all things in a lot of detail. It's really useful, and I recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've just spoken about retention labels, published as policies, and we'll see how they get applied in a minute. Now I'm talking about the retention policies. So just to confuse you, you have label-based retention policies and retention policies that are not based on labels. So here I'm talking about retention policies. So a label-based retention policies, when they're applied to SharePoint in particular, mean that end users can't delete the content from those SharePoint document libraries, which can be a bit of a nuisance, but that's how it works. Retention policies, the one that I've got on the screen now, basically work in the back end. You can't see that they're there. And if you applied it to a SharePoint site, it allows you, by the look of it, to delete content. But actually what happens is that content is being transferred to a preservation hold library. Same with OneDrive for Business. And that content will be held there until the end of the retention policy. And when at the end of the retention period, the content literally just gets deleted. So there's no reference, there's no record of it being kept. It just goes off the cliff and vanishes. So you would more likely create and apply retention policies to Exchange mailboxes, and you might have more than one policy for the mailboxes, to Microsoft Teams chats or channels, to OneDrive accounts, and to SharePoint, to some SharePoint Online sites. So it really depends on your model. You need to understand what these retention policies do to determine whether or not what's the most suitable option. As I said earlier, you're unlikely to get end users appropriately, correctly applying retention labels to the emails or the Teams or the other content. Generally, end users won't do that for you. You have to set these policies, and then that will work in the background. So my recommendation is you would apply one or more retention policies to Exchange mailboxes. So for example, 7 years or 10 years, and that will keep those mailboxes, the content in those mailboxes for that period of time, but end users cannot delete anything. At least it looks like they can, but they can't actually. And same for Teams chat and channels and for OneDrive accounts. So it's a better idea to apply that sort of retention policy to those sort of areas. Now, just to point out here that many organizations will want to certain emails or copy certain emails and keep them in a SharePoint site. That's fine, or a SharePoint document library. That's fine. We're not talking about that. Once you put an email into SharePoint, it's subject to the SharePoint retention policy or the policies that have been applied to SharePoint. So here I'm just talking about the whole mailbox. Now, a lot of people cringe a bit and go, well, if you apply a retention policy, it means they can't delete stuff, and that's not a good thing. We want end users to delete stuff. But the reality is, in most cases, that your IT will be backing up the mailboxes and possibly also journaling some of the mailboxes. So they've got a copy of everything anyway. So the only way to make sure that an email is absolutely deleted is to pretty much delete it as soon as it's sent or received. And then it misses the backups, but it won't miss a journaling if it's subject to journaling. Journaling basically keeps a record of every email sent or received that can be used for investigation purposes and other purposes. So I'm going to move on, but just to point out retention policies. And here's a model that I will probably put on my blog in the next few days that hopefully gives a bit of an overview of what I've just been trying to explain. So on the left-hand side, I've got multiple labels. Some of those labels are published as visible retention policies. So I've got A and B. So you can see that more than one label has been applied to those retention policies. The bottom section shows the implicit or back-end policies that have been applied, that have been created, one 7 years, one 1 year. And those policies have been applied, all 4 policies have been applied in different ways to different parts of my Microsoft 365 environment. So you can see here that my label-based retention policies are applied to SharePoint only, but I've got one retention policy, a implicit retention policy that's also being applied to a SharePoint site. So you can have both on a SharePoint site. So the use case here would be, you might have 5 document libraries that contain specific types of records that map to a retention class, and you need to keep those records. Anything else on the site, you don't really care. It can be destroyed after 3 years. So you could have a retention policy, an implicit one that has a 3-year retention, apply that to the SharePoint site, but you've also got the other retention policies applied to the libraries in that site. The longest retention policy will always win. So retention always wins over deletion. So if you've got a longer retention policy, that content will be kept regardless of there being another one that keeps them for a shorter period of time. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk now about that diagram that we discussed earlier. But just before I do, that diagram about groups, I just want to say a quick word about Teams here. Teams has had a huge amount of increased visibility since we've all been working from home. I've been doing more Teams meetings than you can imagine. Everyone probably has. It's been rolled out and everyone's going, well, let's use Teams, without really understanding what's happening here in the back end. Often Microsoft representatives, if you ask them to come and talk about Microsoft 365, they'll talk about Teams the whole time. I've sat in one of those sessions where I've said, but what about this, what about that? And they said, but we just want you to use Teams. We don't want you to use email anymore. We just want you to use, everything happens in Teams. will say, well, it's not really the case, but okay, I know why you're promoting it this way. It's to promote the product. They're marketing people and they're selling a product. So let's just talk, oh, sorry, just before I move on, each one of those colored boxes that are on the right-hand side under my teams, each one of those is a team and each one has a SharePoint site. Yes, Emily?
You had a question about teams earlier. Should I ask you now?
Let me move to the next slide and then yes, ask now.
Okay, when I find it, it's a lot. Ooh. Where's it going? Oh, is it better to create groups in Microsoft 365 and let that drive site creation, or create teams and let that drive through the collaboration experience? And is there any point in actually having SharePoint sites anymore?
Yeah, so this is the slide that hopefully will answer that. So you can, my recommendation, but it's up to you, is my recommendation is to control the creation of Microsoft 365 groups. You don't have to do this, but if you don't do it, I'll explain what happens. If you don't control the creation of Microsoft 365 groups and SharePoint sites, then anyone with access to Microsoft Teams can, right at the bottom left of your Microsoft Teams, you'll see the option to create a new team. When an end user creates a new team, you have no control over the naming or anything like that. And when they create that team, it creates a group, Microsoft 365 group in the back end. When that group is created, it also creates a mailbox for the group and also a SharePoint site. So Microsoft Teams is sometimes, people say, oh, that's where everything is stored. Actually, no, it's not. Everything is stored in Microsoft Teams. Everything is stored in either the mailbox or the SharePoint site. So they're the arrows going back. So just let me re-say that. So if you allow end users to create a team, it creates a group, which creates a mailbox and a SharePoint site. So every one of your teams has a SharePoint site. That SharePoint site document library is visible from the Files tab in Microsoft Teams. And if you go to that Files tab, you should see the option to open in SharePoint, because every Files tab is presenting a SharePoint document library. It's presenting the default documents library that comes with the SharePoint site that is part of the group. Understood? So what happens when you create chats in Microsoft Teams channels, and also in a one-to-one chat area, those chats first get saved directly to a back-end Azure database. And once that chat is stored in the Azure database, it then copies a version of that chat into the mailbox. So for channel chat, it puts the chat into the group mailbox. For one-to-one chat, it stores that chat record in the personal mailbox of the participants who are on that Teams chat, one-to-one chat. In both cases, they're in a hidden mailbox. The end users can't see those mailboxes, but that's where the records are stored. They're copied from the Azure database into the mailboxes, the chat messages. If you're sharing documents, then in a Teams channel, they get stored in the group's SharePoint site in that Files tab that you've seen. If you're sharing a document in the one-to-one chat area, the documents are stored in the personal OneDrive for Business account of the person who's sharing that document. So if I were to share a document in the one-to-one chat with Emily, that document is stored in my OneDrive for Business account and it's shared with Emily and whoever else is on that chat.
Please don't.
No. So I can at any stage go into my OneDrive account and stop sharing that document. So that means Emily won't see that document if she goes back to that one-to-one chat, because I've ceased to share that. But the point is here, all the content from Microsoft Teams is stored in either mailboxes or in SharePoint or OneDrive. And OneDrive is effectively a SharePoint service. So it's either Exchange or it's SharePoint/OneDrive where that content is stored. So, Emily, question?
Yeah, we've got people are piling in the questions tonight. What would you say an organization determined to allow all users to create new teams? What would you say to, hang on, let me ask that properly. What would you say to ask an oh geez, I can't read anymore. What would you say to an organization determined to allow all users to create new teams, 5,000 plus users?
A effectively, that's almost the same as allowing people to create folders on a network file share. You get uncontrolled naming conventions. You get any content that people want to store in their SharePoint site. You have no naming conventions over your groups anymore. You may find yourself in a situation, as I found with someone yesterday, where they're saying, why can't our end users save content anymore to the SharePoint site? And when they explained how it had happened, the team had a really long name. That team name becomes the group name, which becomes the SharePoint site name. And the end users in that particular area had piled on the folders inside the SharePoint documents library. So they had hit the 400 character limit that you get in SharePoint from HTTPS all the way down to the extension of the document, docx, etc. So basically you get uncontrolled mayhem and content creation. There's nothing, Microsoft actually say this is not a bad thing, and that's why they've suggested, use automatic classification and apply retention policies that way. So their view is just let people do what they need to do. It's like Facebook, after all, just let people do what they want to do, and we'll use AI, artificial intelligence, and algorithms to help you understand and manage that information. I find that that's one view of it. If you decide to do that, as a record or information management person, your job is probably going to be to help clean up that mess at some stage in the future. And often when I find organizations that are doing this, they will say, oh, let's go and have a look at our groups, our list of groups. And you'll get this list of random groups with random names. And you'll get SharePoint sites with the same random names and total no control. Now, the other thing that's really important is the access controls and permissions. So frankly, I wouldn't want to be a SharePoint administrator in an organization that allows end users to create Microsoft Teams, because when an end user creates a Microsoft team, they become the owner of the team, but also the owner of the group and the owner of the SharePoint site. They are also the site collection administrator, so they're an administrator for the SharePoint site that they've created, which gives them all sorts of power to be able to create things and do things that maybe you don't necessarily want them to do. So you can imagine, I've come across people like this who are really, really enthusiastic, I'll use that term in a polite way, about SharePoint. They discover they can create a team that creates a SharePoint site. Once they've got access to the SharePoint site, they realize that they can do what they want on that SharePoint site, and there's really no controls, and they do. And they go off the deep end with doing all sorts of SharePoint site.
I think
another,
this is a very exciting topic, that part of Microsoft 365, because I've got questions pouring in.
It's really important to understand this from a records and information point of view. The ability to create Microsoft Teams freely creates this whole set of SharePoint sites and Microsoft 365 groups and other content that is completely uncontrolled.
Okay. So I'm just going to go through the questions from the beginning to kind of. We've got someone saying, is it possible to stop people from storing and uploading documents to the SharePoint site that sits behind a channel? Channels would be created and governed by IT, if that makes a difference.
Yeah, you really, if you, as your earlier question suggested, if you disable the ability for end users to create Microsoft 365 groups, then you then ask IT to create, or someone in IT to create those groups for you. Those groups create a mailbox and a SharePoint site and can be straight away linked with a team. So it's all part of the same process of creating a group. Create the group, you control the naming conventions, it creates a site, it creates a team. In our environment, we had the same request process for teams as for SharePoint sites, so because they were intimately linked. So if someone wanted a new team or a new SharePoint site, it was the same request. So they would send us the request, and usually within 30 minutes, we would create the group for them, which would create the site and the team. Importantly, as the SharePoint administrators, we provisioned the SharePoint site correctly. We put the right permissions on it. We also did whatever else we needed to do to make sure that SharePoint site was consistent with all our other SharePoint sites. And then the end user could do what they want in Microsoft Teams, go chat away, because they now had a SharePoint site that they could use. Now, another flavor in all of this is that I think what I've started to come to realize that Microsoft 365 groups have the potential to keep records in context. So it's often a problem that mail is in a personal mailbox and you've got records stored somewhere else, whether it's in SharePoint or IRMS. And you've got to say to people, if you've got an email about this particular subject, move it to copy it to IRMS or to the SharePoint site. A Microsoft 365 group has the potential, because they've got an intimately linked mailbox and a SharePoint site, it has the potential to keep both of those records in the context of the group. So the simple example is correspondence management. So you could create a group for correspondence management. It's now got a mailbox and it's got a SharePoint site. So you can see both the emails relating to that group as well as the documents in the SharePoint site. You don't need to drag emails into the SharePoint site because the two are connected to each other. If you extend that a bit further, you could say there's probably a lot of low-level records classes, groups of records that have a particular retention policy applied to them. So description of records, this type of records we create all the time, potentially could become a Microsoft 365 group linked to a business unit, and their mailbox and their SharePoint is linked to that group permanently, and they can have a team as well where they can access this. So that core bit there has the potential to, in a sense, become a way of managing information or keeping records in the context of the group, whatever that group might be. Moving on.
We have lots of questions, but what Rob is in the chat. I've asked him to answer some of them if possible, just because I'm aware of time. If we're out of time, then I'll ask you the questions after we've finished, if that's okay.
All right. I want to move on to SharePoint because I'm very conscious of time, and this bit will probably take a bit more. So, what you're seeing on the screen now. In a sense, it sort of helps to answer the question about what to do about groups and teams. So on the right-hand side, a number of boxes. The blue boxes are standard SharePoint sites. They're out-of-the-box standard SharePoint sites. They're not linked with a team or with a group. The green boxes are connected with a team or a Microsoft 365 group. The purple boxes on the right-hand side are communication sites. So my recommendation is organizations, if you haven't already done it and you need to do this retrospectively, I used a spreadsheet for this the whole time. You don't have to, but I used a spreadsheet, and every one of these boxes was a cell on the spreadsheet, and it allowed me to see where all my SharePoint sites were, and we had about 550 of them when I left, where all my SharePoint sites were, what business area owns them, as in group them simply on the spreadsheet based on which business area owned them. And the business area generally mapped to a function. So the SharePoint sites broadly mapped to the function of the business that was creating records. This allowed me to see, if someone said to me, one business area came to me and said, we'd like to have a SharePoint site. And I said to them, well, you're a fairly small group. It probably would be better for us to create a group for you. So you've got not only your mailbox, but you've got your SharePoint site, and we can connect you to a team as well too, so you can chat there. So we found very quickly a lot of quick take up in that sort of lower level, around 15 to 20 people, even 5 to 25 people groups, logical business groups, really took to teams really quickly. And I suspect most other organizations have done this as well too. It's a small group of people that like to chat together all the time, that communicate, they're part of a business unit. They may be a logical team, which becomes a logical Microsoft 365 group, and they have a SharePoint site. So as part of your architecture, you need to consider where are these records going. Broadly speaking, my suggestion is that at the higher level, those big business division or departmental SharePoint sites are likely to be where you'll store static formal records of that business division or department. So the meetings, the committees, or whatever you might want to store. The next level down, a business unit within that division might have a group site, might have just a standard SharePoint site. And that's also where you'll probably find records are stored, but you might also get a few more working documents, working records in those lower level sites. Then when you get down a bit further again and you're into the group-based sites, this is with a small group of people, you're probably going to have a bit less control over what happens in there. You may not have really any concern about how they set up their document libraries and so on. These are really low-level sites that can be used to store records. So understanding your architecture and saying, well, where in this architecture model are my SharePoint sites can be quite helpful. As I mentioned before, you need to understand that the old SharePoint is not the same as the new SharePoint. If in your existing or your old SharePoint environment, SharePoint 2010, 2013, 2016, if you have lots of subsites, they don't translate very well to SharePoint Online. Generally, what we found, we ended up creating, basically taking all of our subsites away from the parent sites and creating them as independent sites, very often as group-based sites. So our architecture model was, okay, we've got a business division with lots of subsites. Now we have a business unit SharePoint site, standard SharePoint site, and we have lots of connected group-based sites that used to be the subsites of that main site. So understanding that, move away from the concept of subsites. You may decide to use what are called hub sites. I don't particularly like using hub sites, but organizations might find them useful. It's an alternative to using subsites, but there are certain inheritance things that happen with hub sites that you may not want to have. If you've got a good architecture, you should think about your naming, your naming convention. So my recommendation is keep your names to 12 to 14 characters long. So think about teams for 12 to 14 characters long, the group 12 to 14 characters, because that becomes the name of the SharePoint site. Yes, Emily?
We appear to be losing signal of some kind. It's just starting to break up, and we're just wondering if it's the storms or if it's something else. Hopefully we can carry on, but people are mentioning in the chat that they're struggling. So we shall try our best.
Okay, I'm not aware of any problem with the signal here, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the storms here.
I'll carry on.
But yeah, sorry to interrupt. Yes.
All right, so that's right. And now with each of these SharePoint sites, you also need to consider the access controls and what you should have access to. My strong recommendation is if you're a records or information management person, you should belong to the site collection administration group of every SharePoint site. Now, not everyone agrees with that. Not every IT manager will allow you to do that. But my view is that at least one records or senior records person should be in a site collection admin group, not to manage the sites, but simply to give you the access to all the sites that are being created. Now, remember I said earlier that if you allow end users to create teams, the SharePoint site that they create, they're the site collection administrator. So you have no visibility of all these additional SharePoint sites that are being created. But if you do it the other way around and you create the SharePoint, you create the groups, which creates the SharePoint sites, you have the ability to provision those sites and add things like add yourself to the site collection administration. We're going to not have enough time to talk a lot about metadata and content types, but essentially we'll talk a bit about in the next 2 slides, but metadata is almost limitless in SharePoint. If anything, what you need to do is be careful that you don't use it too much. Metadata, SharePoint has the ability to have so much metadata applied to it. Do you need all that metadata? Do you really want to bother end users with all that metadata? It depends. There are certain records where you will need it and a lot of records that you probably won't need it. So up to you as an organization to work out, trying to apply the same metadata every single library on every single SharePoint site will drive you insane and probably drive your end users away from using SharePoint. The other important thing about metadata is that if you allow syncing of document libraries to File Explorer, that metadata is not visible in File Explorer. So we'll come back to that if we have time.
Turn your webcam off,
One thing
Andrew.
about SharePoint is using content types. Say it again. Say it again.
If you turn your webcam off, I'm going to see if that will help. I'm going to turn mine off as well.
How do I turn it off? Stop sharing?
Yes. Sorry. People are struggling. you hover over your name, you should,
get myself back.
if you hover, there you go. Okay, and then if you share again like you did before.
Right, we've got quite a few slides to get through, so, and I can see we're not going to get through. Are we okay now?
Yeah, much better now, thank you.
All right, might have been the screen. So I'm going to move on quickly because there's quite a few slides to get through. So we've only got about maximum about 15 minutes, I think, isn't it?
So where there are questions unanswered, I'm either going to ask Rob to answer them or I'll ask Andrew afterwards, more likely the latter. Yeah, we will get your questions answered.
Yeah.
I can, perhaps it's best if like we put questions up on your blog, Andrew, if that's possible.
Yeah, or just email them to me. Happy to have direct emails.
I don't keep the data
or on the blog
registered, so it's easier just to put it on somewhere publicly accessible and people can see them there. So if you just keep an eye on Andrew's blog for the questions that have been put in, and we'll get them across to you. Thank you. Carry on, Andrew. Sorry.
All right. Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to go relatively quickly through this because we won't have the time otherwise. But every SharePoint site has document libraries. From a record keeping point of view, my view is that a library is a logical aggregation or the container that should map to business activities and has a retention policy applied to it. That's just my personal view. You don't necessarily have to see it the same way. But we found that that was very useful, so that every library was effectively your file in the sense of a paper file, where all the records relating to a particular activity were stored. In our case, we manage, in some of our team sites, we created new libraries every year so that we could keep a better control over the content that was in those libraries on a yearly basis, particularly on team sites that had gone for years and years and years. They'd have meetings, 2012, 2013, 2014, every year. So they would create a new library for each year rather than use a single library and use folders to structure the content. It's sometimes better to actually create new libraries. The document libraries are visible as the Files tab in Teams. We're not going to get to talk about metadata or content types here. I'll just show you a few slides from SharePoint. So here's what's called a list view, including the main menu bar for every SharePoint document library. So you can see there's the documents listed down against the metadata. At the bottom is this view of the same library in File Explorer. So if you sync that document library to File Explorer, that's all you see. So you can see on the top screenshot, there's a one column called function. That custom column that I've added to this library isn't visible in File Explorer. All I'm seeing in File Explorer is the documents. Now, you need to be aware that if you make any columns mandatory so that users have to add metadata, that will make the synced document library read-only. So not only can they not see the metadata, but if there's any mandatory metadata, it'll make it read-only, which can be a nuisance. So you need to consider carefully mandatory metadata and the use of metadata if your end users are going to be using the sync to File Explorer option. We found that our end users, once they discovered they could work from File Explorer by syncing the document library, they hardly ever went back to SharePoint because it was just easy to work from File Explorer. But in some cases, they still had to do it, but it was easy to do it that way. This is the same document library in the Teams, so the Files tab of Teams. That's how it looks. It's exactly the same library. Create new, as you probably, if you're using this product already, you'll know that when you save a record, the default option is OneDrive or SharePoint. So when you do save as, you'll see here's the list of SharePoint sites that you can save to, and you can navigate to those. So they're really trying to push you into saving to SharePoint or to OneDrive rather than using your network file shares. The other document management functionality, you've got versioning and you've got checkout, check-in. The versioning is quite good, but really it's revisions rather than versions. Many cases you'll probably find that putting the version number next to the document name, so V1, V2, final, whatever, is probably a better way to do versions and use the revisions or so-called versions here to be able to view what people have changed, because you can view previous versions and you can restore those previous versions if required. I've got an asterisk against audit trails because audit trails are a bit of an issue. Audit trails have more or less been removed from SharePoint directly, where they used to be, and they're now visible from the compliance portal, which can be a problem. So if you've got a requirement to keep the audit data or the logs, particularly the process metadata of records, you may need to consider carefully what you need to capture and where you need to capture this, and you may potentially need a third-party product to do that. All right, OneDrive, just quickly, we're going to talk about OneDrive. OneDrive should only be used for personal content, not business records. This really is a communication thing. This is how do you get this message across to your end users. It's not always easy to do that. There's two types of retention you can apply to OneDrive accounts, one when the account is still active and one when the account becomes inactive. There's the possibility of a gap between those two. So for example, if your account is active, if your retention policy for active accounts is say 3 years and the person is there for 5 years, the first 2 years of their OneDrive will basically disappear. Whereas when they leave, whatever's left will continue on with the storage policy if it's applied. You might consider having a policy to review people's OneDrive for business content when they leave. At least look at the volume, look at the size, and consider whether or not, based on who they were, whether or not it's worth having a look at that content. Global admins can access that content. The 3 other records management features available from the compliance admin portal, the audit logs, they only are kept for 3 months and you can only search back for 3 months. If you've got an E5 license, you get 1 year. This is an issue. A lot of people say, well, we'll need to export those audit logs. Well, talk to IT about that because audit logs are enormous. We tried to do that and discovered that it was just not worth trying to do. It was just too big. Content searches across everything, but you create a case in content search. You create a case, and every time you create a case in content search and run it, the global admins are alerted to that. So it's not a one-off search. You know, I want to go and find if there is anything about me in the system. If I do that, the global admins are alerted to that, and there's a record kept to that global search. So you can't get away with just searching for anything. But the positive is it does search literally across everything, including in individual teams chat, which could be useful. And we've spoken about the advanced records management functionality before, which I'll just pass over here. Okay, just quickly talking about the graph and Cortex. So what happens is every time any content is created in Microsoft 365, it passes through, or it's analyzed by this thing called the graph. The graph basically looks at the signals and the so-called digital exhaust that occur. So what's the connections between people? What's the connection between files? If I send a file to Emily, it knows that I've got some connection with Emily. It looks at the subject and it says, okay, this is interesting. Now, the graph is not dissimilar to, you know, your Facebook friends and your LinkedIn jobs and your eBay or Amazon. You know, do you want to buy this product? It's basically, it's a digital thing. It's an electronic thing analyzing. It's an AI-driven thing that's analyzing the data. There's something called a Graph Explorer that as admins you can have a look at. Here's an example here where I've clicked on Get My Mail, and on the right-hand side you can see some of the metadata that's associated with one of the email in my account. So all of the data in Microsoft 365 is rich in metadata, and that metadata is exploited by the Graph Explorer and by the graph. So you can see some examples of the massively interesting metadata that's listed there. Project Cortex uses AI to and into topics. The graph powers Delve and Discover. And Discover is that option. When you go into office.com and you scroll down, you'll see the Discover option. It shows you information that you've got access to that you might be interested in. So it's working out what your interests are, and it's saying, hey, you might be interested in having a look at this particular content. That sometimes freaks people out a bit, and they say, why am I seeing stuff from my colleagues? Well, you're seeing that stuff because it's, first of all, it's accessible to you. And secondly, Microsoft is saying that based on what you do in your work, you might have an interest in this. So if you're seeing content that you think you shouldn't see and discover, it's probably worth having a chat to that person and working out what the permissions are. In a sense, this comes back to Teams and the uncontrolled creation of SharePoint sites where people are sharing stuff with everybody and you never know who's got access to it. On the screen at the moment is simply a screenshot from a GIF based on, based on a Microsoft page that shows the trending knowledge topics. And what's interesting about the knowledge topics and the topic cards is that this is driven automatically by AI. This is not something that you create. It does it automatically for you. And it's interesting because what it does is it relates content, people, and other information into a topic based on what it's learning from the information that's in the system. All right, we've got 2 slides left. And I've said right at the you need a plan. You need to collaborate with IT. If you're not IT, you need to collaborate. If you're IT, you need to collaborate with RM, I think. You need to understand that records are not just stored in SharePoint, they're stored across Microsoft 365. You need to think about your retention requirements. As I've emphasized heavily in this, what do you do about 365 groups and teams? How are you going to manage that? What's your architecture model for SharePoint? How are you going to work out what that architecture model should be or could be, or retrospectively what it does look like? What are your metadata requirements? We haven't spoken about the managed metadata service or the content types at all, particularly. Both of those have been updated or about to be updated in SharePoint. We found out we hardly ever used the managed metadata service and we rarely use content types, but it might be useful in some organizations. As I said earlier, be careful in some ways the extent to which you want to use your metadata, because end users generally don't like adding metadata to content. So the more you can make use of the automatic metadata, the default metadata options, then that'd be a good idea. We spoke about network file share migration and managing the ROT. How are you going to manage disposal? We don't really have the time to talk about managing disposal, but this is a really important point to understand, that disposal is something you need to understand how to do this in Microsoft 365, whether it's off the edge of the cliff disposal with a retention policy or disposition reviews. You do need to spend a bit of effort to understand how it works and where the weaknesses are and what extra effort you may need to put into it, or potentially other products you may need to buy to help you manage disposal. You don't necessarily have to have them, but you need to understand how it works. You may also need to think about change, how to bring about change. People can be quite resistant to change, surprisingly. We found that there was a strong preference to work privately via email rather than speaking out loud or chatting out loud in chats or Yammer or whatever. We found that people would deliberately revert to old ways of working, like saving to a desktop or USB, attaching things to email instead of sharing documents, which is a much better, more efficient and more secure way of sharing stuff. So you've got to kind of watch out for this. Fortunately, Microsoft 365 includes a whole range of both training and educational material, but also monitoring that allows you to monitor what's going on in your environment. You do need good communication, and I found that top-level leadership is really essential. You need to have your CEO on board. You need to have their managers on board. You need to have their managers on board. Otherwise, you get one person in the overall building, that organization, that doesn't want to do this, that doesn't want to contribute and be part of it, then you'll find that you have problems potentially. Emily.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Andrew. That has been a mind-blowing hour and a half, I have to say. There's been people going, oh my God, my brain. Versus they were going, so useful, thank you very much. And yeah, we've got comments saying that was extraordinary. So yeah, so just kind of like, I used to do a bit of a round of applause, as it were, when other people start clapping in the chat, sorry. So yes, thank you very much. We do have several questions that are outstanding, and so people are sending an information overload. But yeah, we have questions afterwards, so I will come back to you in. I'll send them to you on email, Andrew. And so yeah, so. Ooh, sorry, what?
No, that's fine. I'm more than happy to answer as many questions as people like to ask. Maybe it'll give me a couple of days so that there may be the similar question to different people.
Yeah.
So make sure that we've got all the questions. But I'm always happy to respond. And often the questions that are being asked of me become blog posts. So as the answers.
There's been a constant question of, will you share the slides from tonight? So
yeah. Happy to share the slides.
Okay,
so happy to share them.
So Andrew will send his slides across to me, and we'll share it on the IRMS London page that you'll find when you log in. As mentioned, this is being recorded, and so it will be uploaded to YouTube. But give me a chance because it means I have to edit it, and there's a bit of a backlog. So they will be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and you need to like and subscribe in order to get a notification when it comes up. Also, next week, we have Adele Redhead with Next Generation IRM Practitioners. There is a setup event already for you to sign up. I'll be putting it across all social media channels, etc. shortly. Just a reminder is that these IRMS WOW sessions for IRMS London only come to an end on the 15th of July. So I'm taking a break, as it were. But there is other webinars that are happening by the other group chairs that you can still join in. I did manage, for those that attended the panel that I set up, I did manage to set up a second version of the panel, and they will return as the last webinar on the 15th of July. Also, I've been sharing on Twitter tonight Andrew's blog and everything and the links to that. So do go have a look there. For those that are in the chat right now who aren't members, this is the kind of content that you get as being a member. So there is more of this to come in the future, whether that's open to everybody or not, or whether it's just to members. The future is a little unknown right now. So you can, basically, if you sign up, this is the kind of content that you get. One of the things that when I took over IRMS London that I was really keen on doing is that I've been a practitioner for nearly 15 years. And I go to events and get frustrated that I don't particularly learn anything useful. So what I try to do is find a topic and do a deep dive on it. And so, yes, is that these kind of even face-to-face meetings are at this kind of high level that you can attend. So, yes, just a final thanks to Andrew for getting up at ridiculous o'clock in the morning. It's literally the middle of the night for you, as far as I'm concerned. And what did you get up at 2:30 this morning?
Yeah, something like that, but it's fine.
So yes, 2:30, and yes, so that's it, guys. So thanks very much, and a round of applause for Andrew. Thank you very much for your time, and I shall see you all next week, 6:30, for more webinars on Wednesday. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Andrew. When I press end, you'll just, oh, it's gone already. Bye, everyone.